Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. In the episode for Bottle 25, Seagram's Cherry Cola Schnapps, I told you that it wouldn't be long before we had another bottle of Seagram's product, and here it is. Bottle number 32 is Seagram's Amandine, their take on an amaretto liqueur. Like the Cherry Cola Schnapps, there's almost no information about this bottle on the internet. A picture of it from 1983 is in the same box 37 of the Seagram Company archive that the Cherry Cola Schnapps photo is in, located at the Hagley Museum in Delaware. 1983 makes perfect sense for an amaretto liqueur. In my episode about bottle number 10, Di Serono, I talk about how amaretto was introduced as a follow-on to Galliano in the 1970s, and how it became a darling of what passed for mixology in the 1980s. Part of the reason Di Serono no longer uses the word amaretto on their label is because of all of these other brands, like Seagram's, trying to break into their market. The other thing I found online about this bottle was a listing for it in a package donated by the Seagram's Company to a Radiothon fundraiser for the Montreal Symphony Orchestra in 1985. It was part of a 3-bottle package with a coffee liqueur and a tamarind liqueur. The tamarind liqueur to me is the most interesting thing about this. That feels way ahead of its time. Based on these two things, I'm putting a date range on this tiny bottle in the mid-1980s. And that's really all there is to say about it. So this seems like a good opportunity to tell more of the Seagram story. When last we left the Bronfman family in bottle 25, they'd made a boatload of money creatively taking advantage of tax loopholes during Prohibition and doing things that a court never said were actually bootlegging, but they had not yet become Seagram's. When they'd opened up their first distillery in LaSalle, Quebec, they registered their company name as Distillers Corporation Limited. And if you watched Bottle 31, Vat 69 Scotch, you'll know this was actually quite a baller move, because at that time, Distillers Corporation Limited was an enormous force in Scotland and controlled most of the world's Scotch whiskey supply. Clearly, the Bronfman brothers had big dreams. Or at least one Bronfman brother did. Sam Bronfman, known throughout the company as Mr. Sam, would position himself as the power broker in the family. He directed the company's operations as it grew and cut out other family members if it suited him. The Canadian Distillers Corporation Limited was a customer of the Scottish one, purchasing whiskies to blend and sell. And in 1927, the two became partners, with Mr. Sam negotiating a deal where the Scottish DCL would gain a 50% share of his company. In exchange, the Canadian DCL got the exclusive distribution rights in Canada for the Scottish DCL's stable of brands. This included prominent Scotch names like Dewar's, Haig, and Black & White. Importantly, the deal also came with technical support and expertise about distillery operations, as well as whiskey making and blending, and Mr. Sam devoted himself to learning all he could. In 1928, this joint operation purchased the Seagram Distillery in Waterloo, Ontario, and at that point, 12 years after the Bronfmans first started selling alcohol, they start to become Seagram's by renaming themselves to Distillers Corporation Seagram's Limited, DCSL. By the end of the 1920s, DCSL had a lot to show for itself. 2 distilleries, over 1 million gallons of aging whiskey, and several popular brand names from the Seagram distillery purchase, and purchase and distribution rights with DCL, one of the largest whiskey suppliers in the world. Seeing the end of US Prohibition on the horizon, they began stockpiling whiskey and were ready to hit go on their American strategy when FDR signed repeal into law. The 1930s and 40s were hectic times. Scottish DCL had other plans for their US strategy, so DCSL bought out their share of the joint interest. A short-lived partnership with important US competitor Shenley Industries fell apart, but on the bright side, DCSL purchased 18 American distilleries between 1934 and 1945. They created their 5 Crown and 7 Crown blends in Maryland by blending their imported Canadian whiskey with these new American whiskey stocks. Blending and aging whiskey became the company's hallmark, as Mr. Sam applied what he'd learned from the partnership with Scottish DCL. He wanted to make whiskey as respectable in the US and Canada as it was in Scotland. One key to this was selling whiskey in bottles instead of in barrels, as was typical at the time. This resulted in better consistency and thus customer loyalty. All this meant that by the end of the 1940s, Seagram's was the biggest of the big 4 that I talked about with Bottle 29, De Kuyper Bluesberry Schnapps. This feels like a good place to end this part of the story, but there are more Seagram's products lurking right around the corner where you might least expect them. Be sure to hit like and subscribe buttons below so you won't miss them. Have a story to share? Drop a comment. And check out mytinybottles.com and @mytinybottles on social media for more. Cheers!